Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Lunch and Learns. I'm Sarah Paxton. I'm the Community Events Manager at Optimal Workshop. And I'm just going to hand it straight over to our speaker, Sarah Clearwater.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. A real joy to be able to share this space with you here today. Kia ora koutou nau mai haere mai ko Sarah Clearwater tako ingoa. It's a real joy to also share this moment with all of you who are here curious about what design and leadership might mean for our work going forward. As Sarah kindly outlined, this has been a piece of work that's been in the making for several months. And it's something that's very close to my heart. What I want to do with you over the next half an hour or so is take you on a bit of a journey around where I came from and why this is such an interesting piece, I think, of insight into where we are as an ecosystem, where we're at as a community, and also signposts possibly to where we might want to go next. And to do that, I want to bring us a bit on the same page around what is design, or what I understand to be design, what do I understand to be leadership, and then what is that intersection? And to obviously make this really actionable for you here in the room today, I also want to make sure that there are sort of 3 questions that you can walk away with that you can reflect on to help you get started on your journey of design leadership. And that should all roughly take about half an hour. And then at the end, there should be a time for sort of a Q&A or really an open conversation. I think everybody who was in the room here today probably has a really unique perspective on this piece of work and on the insights that I'm sharing back with you. And I, for one, am really curious to hear what you make of it. So, the journey. If I was to sort of do a quick snapshot, I'm born in West Berlin to East German and Egyptian parents. Any intersection you can possibly imagine is colliding in that city, from communism to capitalism, to sort of different religions, to atheists, to spiritual crazies. Sort of every economic model under the sun has come to life in that city. And I was born there just at the end of
Well, it looks like Sarah's frozen.
So I actually started out.
I think your internet cut out just briefly.
Did it? Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me better now?
Yes. I'll
awesome.
Pop back in if anything happens. Awesome.
Thank you, Sarah. That's awesome. Yeah, and so I guess I would like to call myself an intersection child, and you will see that throughout this presentation, the notion of intersection is emerging, and that's my personal bias. So I just want to be really explicit around that. Yeah, and so because I guess I was trying to make sense of the world in its diversity and difference and dichotomy, I went into the humanities and got a degree in European Studies, which is effectively human systems, and then started my career in the UK as a policy advisor. And along that journey, I met a wonderful young man who happened to be a New Zealander, and he told me these stories of the land of the country and the people nevertheless, and chose to stay. Now, my career pivoted really quickly from sort of public policy and community activation into design, specifically into qualitative research. And I had a real curiosity around how we can manifest a design curiosity into systems and structures and behaviors that help organizations think differently about the way that they show up in markets and communities. And alongside that journey, I think I also came to realize that what designers are trying to do is actually a pretty difficult thing. If you think about what design promises, which is ultimately a world where we are focused on humans, where we're elevating people's needs and lived experience into places and spaces of power and decision making, and communicate that our job is to serve and respond to people's needs and not just about making money, that can be quite a difficult message to try and get across and sustain across an organization that has really different beliefs and values, right? Namely, one around speed and scale and profit and productivity and efficiency. And so out of sort of that challenge that I kept seeing across different teams and organizations I was working with here as an independent consultant, I started the CX Collective, which is community of designerly minded folk who are leading the change towards customer in their organization. And at that intersection of being a independent consultant who's doing all the design work and moving between sectors, between disciplines, and being embedded in this community of people who have really, really strong aspirations for places to be different to where they are today, I came across these, I guess, these patterns where some teams, design teams in particular, were able to really shift the dial, shift the dialogue, shift the narrative inside corporate and government organizations around what design could do, not just for the success of the organization, but for the way that systems and societies are structured. And there are some teams who really, really struggle with that. And I suppose my curiosity sat in validating or amplifying or getting greater clarity around those patterns that I saw. So Perspectives on Designer Leadership is effectively an attempt at feeding my own curiosity around what we understand design to be and how leadership can be a lever for us to push design-led thinking and seeing and ways of showing up into organizations. Now, I want to be really explicit around the fact that the report findings I'm about to share with you are grounded in the experiences and the mahi and the mātauranga and the skills and the lessons and the ideas of many other people. So my self-appointed role was very much just to have a conversation with 28 of them who sit across the wider design and innovation ecosystem of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and almost pull out, the themes and the ideas and the perspectives that sort of stood out from them. So what I want to do with you going forward is to explore two things, or sort of set a baseline of shared understanding, one for design and one for leadership. And to do that, I'd be really curious to hear from you. What do you think design is? You might maybe take a moment, and this is a judgment-free, no right or wrong answer sort of question that I'm curious, because I was there about 9 months ago to go, what is design, right? And if you will humor me and share that with me in the chat, I would absolutely love that. And just have a think, like, what does design mean? What is design? Thank you, Velvet, for kicking us off. Creative problem solving came up in the chat. There's a lot around problem solving. Thank you, Karen. Nice. Visual communication, purposeful action, making stuff usable, Charlotte. Lovely. Proactively creating experience, David. Thank you. So what I love around, I guess, many of the answers that have been coming forward is that they are all informed by the way that we practice design, right? And if there's one thing that we know about design, is that there are many, many different permutations of how this shows up. And that was the same thing that came up in the report. I would say the one thing that we could agree on, though, no matter the conversation, was that design is actually an agitator. In terms of business or organizations more generally, design is a new kid around the block, right? We've shown up here and gone, hey, did you know that there are people out there who buy from you or who use your services who've got needs? And did you know that they're really different to yours? And by the way, we think serving their needs is more important than serving your own. So ultimately, when we think about design, we have to be aware of the fact that what we're bringing is a completely different way of thinking and being and showing up in the commercial world. And as such, we are an agitator. We are all, by the sheer fact that we exist inside an organization, we bring with us the promise of change. That is damn scary, right? For organizations that we work with. But we all anchor in what I think is our unique craft. And when I talk about craft, what I mean by that are the skills and the perspectives, the tools, the methodologies, the lenses that we introduce into a specific context. My personal craft, right, is the social sciences, the humanities. Someone else's craft might be journalism or criminology or medicine or whatever else, maybe even actual visual design, where you're, skilled in typography and colors. But it is through applying our craft in our context that our practice actually emerges, right? So without context, we have no design practice. And that's really important, because what that tells us is that the context we are in fundamentally shapes and influences the craft elements that we push back into our context that then constitute our practice. So here's a really tangible example. As a consultant, obviously, I work in lots of different industries with lots of different organizations. And if I take an example from 2 years ago, where I was working with an insurance company, and they wanted to sort of gain insight into how a particular part of the app was fitting to the broader customer journey. So we did all the usual stuff around empathy interviews and journey mapping and sort of mapping touch points to strategic objectives, back-end processes from the blueprint and all stuff like that you'd all be well familiar with. And of course, the primary tools or the primary philosophies I was bringing in was one of human-centered design, of the double diamond, and decision-making principles around quantity over quality, prototype quickly, hard and fast, test it to make sure you're right. Sort of quite the popular design thinking lens, if you will. And then last year, I was doing a project for an international charity who wanted to build almost like an independence program for some of the communities that they were supporting. Now, a hard and fast, fail, dirty, quickly approach wasn't going to work in that environment. So then with the charity, I needed to think about, well, what sort of principles of participatory research and participatory design can I bring into this? How do my decision-making principles around what is good and bad and right and wrong and suitable and unsuitable, how does that have to change? What are some of the concrete tools that I can offer? And I'm no longer the one telling them what to do. I am the one who are offering building blocks for them to put together to create their own pathway towards independence. So my craft fundamentally had to shift to respond to the context I was in. Another example would be for this piece of research, it's probably the first time I've actually applied a researcher's diary. I've never made a diary about my research prior to this, but I've never spent 6 months involved in a subject matter I care deeply about. And I needed a mechanism to separate my own insights, beliefs, and perspectives from that of the people I was interviewing. So a diary was a really effective way to do that. So now a researcher's diary is part of my toolkit, that is part of my craft that I can choose to deploy or not, depending on the context I'm in, right? So if I had to think about design, I would say it's a practice that is responsive and evolving based on what we see in front of us. Yeah, and that might be about solving problems, but I can also tell you that a lot of the people I am working with have given up solving problems because the environment they're in are so complex that working towards a singular problem and a system of problems is no longer workable. And so I think the decision that you are making as a designer or whatever you call your practice, is to go, what am I bringing, and what's in front of me right now, and what is the relevant and necessary response to enable the flow between the two. Yeah. So I just want to hold that for a moment here as sort of a perspective on design, and then move into leadership. And I want to ask you the same question. What do you think leadership is? Demonstrating the path and encouraging your team to follow. Nice. Bringing out the best in your team. Awesome. To guide the team to be the best that they can be. Empowering or inspiring others. Inspiring and enabling people. Empowering others to be successful. Using your experience to help others. Nice. Providing a vision. Oh, nice one, David. So what I already love about what you're sharing here with me in the chat is that none of this really is about position, about or about sort of your expertise, or about, you know, the traditional attributes we give leadership. Often leadership is seen as an extension or a showing up of power. When we work in organizations, we often unintentionally give up our agency because we are not in a position, quote unquote, of power. We don't manage enough or the right people or manage people at all. We don't have the years of experience that is required to move into a GM role or into a design manager role, or whatever it might be. And what I find fascinating as part of the research is that that exactly showed up there too. So although I was speaking with people who were in or near formal leadership positions, or what I call functional leadership roles, where they had a budget, you know, manage a P&L and have a bunch of people to report into them, many of them frequently spoke about the fact that everybody in their team is a leader, or that anybody in their team can be a leader. But how that shows up depends on where you are in the system. So one of the strongest thing that came up is that a leader really is someone who can offer a perspective that sits beyond where we are today, right? A perspective that is different from what we believe to be true or just practice or accept in the current state. I think the quote from Penny Hagen is really interesting in that Penny co-leads the Auckland CoLab, which is a public sector sort of innovation space. And many who work in the social innovation context see the CoLab as leaders in their field. Now, Penny and Angie, who co-lead the lab, didn't go and say we're leaders. What they said is that we need to approach things differently, and here's a possible way of how to do that. And people were really inspired by what they were doing and wanted to better understand how they could emulate what they were doing. And so the crucial element here, I think, is the perspective that they have offered to, for example, say the design process is not a production process. It's a change process. Let's use it that way, right? That is a perspective shift. And so then, as many of you rightly outlined, where we can actually observe leadership is in its application, is in its action. And so I think we sometimes think leadership action is really big and hairy and difficult, and it can be, but it can start really small. So to give you another example, I think I was working in a local government agency several years ago, and that government agency was really committed to improving their service experience. So they're starting to measure, not quite, but a predecessor of NPS. They were trying to introduce better frameworks into the call center so people would have a better experience and so on. And there was one person in the organization who said, hey, there's something that sits beyond the customer experience. There's actually something that's tied back to how employees feel as being part of this organization. And there's probably a way to unpack that and help senior management understand. Now, that person wasn't in any particular senior role. That person didn't have a particularly fancy title or had people report into her. What she did do is tap about 5 of us on the shoulder who had, I guess, experience and were curious about a human-centered design approach to solving problems. And she brought us together and said, hey, I think we could, do a bit of an experiment here where we maybe interview some staff members and then put together a bit of a series of workshops and a report with some recommendations to help leadership in this organization see things differently. And so the action that she took was just to convene us. That was the leadership action that was required at that moment in time to take one step closer towards the vision or the opportunity that she saw. Right? So, and the other thing I think that is worthwhile highlighting here is that this also happens during moments in time. So following on from this example, my friend didn't then also lead the research and lead the workshops and write the report and do all of that. The leadership moment for her was the convening, but other people were then able to demonstrate leadership in the research phase, in running the workshops, in communicating the research findings, in putting together recommendations and try and get them executed. We often think of leadership as a continuous, all-encompassing, omnipresent persona or attribute, where what the research is suggesting that key leadership actions happen in moments in spaces during moments in time. And so I think the opportunity that this offers us here is to say that leadership is a deliberate approach to change by holding perspectives such as bringing evidence of lived experience into the boardroom will help us make better decisions about the future for this organization. That is a perspective that is fundamentally different to where many organizations are. The action we then might take from that is to say, you know what, here is research with 10 people and a survey, and together here's what we're seeing in terms of where we sit and how we could be doing better. And then the moments to show up in a leaderly way might be by sharing it back with your executive or by motivating adjacent teams to take action. Yeah. And so if we were to bring the two together, what we have is ultimately design leadership as the vehicle for change. We have a practice that intentionally responds to what's in front of us, paired with the levers we have at our disposal, not just to see what needs to change, but respond to that in a really intentional, meaningful way. None of this has to do with your title. None of this has to do with how many people report to you. None of this has to do with your years of experience. What this report, or what the research is offering, is to say leadership is accessible to all of us. But if we choose to step into it, that is the question we need to answer for ourselves. Part of the research also suggested that we can actually dive a bit deeper into the leadership paradigm with particular relevance to design. And so if we unpack or unlayer the leadership in the design context, what I was hearing was that what we bring in our craft or through our craft is actually a set of philosophies, so things we believe in, like we want to center on humans, or it's really important that we have ethics attached to our research practice. They're beliefs that we bring into our practice, that constantly bump up against our context. We have as a result, a set of decision-making principles like quality over quantity, quantity over quality, or, no bad ideas, or something like that. How do your principles might also be manifested in your design system, right? That show up to help you make decisions. And again, there are a bunch of processes like the double diamond, like research methods, and things like that, that form your craft, but also your leadership levers. You can choose to lead through philosophy. You can choose to lead through process. You can choose to lead through your principles. And then you can lean into or lead into the dominant paradigms that you find yourself confronted with. Speed, scale, productivity, agile is a really great example of a dominant paradigm within organizations we're facing at the moment. Who are the people whose hearts and minds that we're trying to win, we're trying to convince, we're trying to bring on the journey with us. And then one of the place-based conditions, right? Place could be your team, your squad, could be your organization, your city, your country. It could be an area of identity, such as tribal lands that might not be clearly defined, but they still constitute place, and as such has got their own history, their own geography, and so on. So what I want to offer you as a really high level is that when we think about practicing design, we want to be aware of the things that we bring and aware of the things that we are facing. Leadership as an intentional approach to change asks of us, what do we think that needs to change to achieve the greater goal of a more human-centered organization, or a world-class design system, or a research knowledge base that everybody can draw on and from? And then go, what is the next step I can take, levering one of my craft elements or levering one of my context conditions, and then go, okay, what are the moments that this change journey is made up of? So if I was to offer you 3 questions for you to take away to start reflecting on what does your leadership journey might look like, how might you start on that? I would ask you exactly that. What is your or your team's North Star that drives you, right? Leadership doesn't have to be an individual activity. In fact, most successful change movements have been led and are executed by many. What is the next step or the next few steps that will help us close the delta between what could be and what is? And who else might be able to come on that journey with us? And therefore, where can you intuitively provide leadership? Meaning, where can you intuitively provide a direction and offer a perspective on the next step that might, help you show up in a leaderly way where you are most suited to lead? Because we all have really unique abilities and spaces and moments to lead in, right? I will never ever lead in usability spaces, right? But I look to others to help me understand how a usability perspective can add, for example, to a bigger aspiration around becoming an organization that is truly not just human-centered, but human-led, right? Or responsive to. And knowing that is really, really important, because what that also does is create space for others to step into their leadership. Now, I hope that this rapid fire sort of overview of design leadership didn't fully overwhelm you. I know that there are a bunch of reasonably complex concepts in here. And if you're curious, you are more than welcome to download the report from my website, which is sarahclearwater.com. And you can just get a copy of the report and sort of, sit yourself down with a cup of tea and really digest all of that. I'm also running a 5 months on-demand course with the CX Collective for people who are curious about exploring their change leadership in more detail and understand what it means to lead change in a designerly sort of way. And of course, I'm also offering training and one-on-one coaching for teams and people who want to step into more of a leadership role within their organization. And I know Sarah will put all of those links in the chat so that you have access to that if you're curious. But for now, I want to say thank you so much for your time and your attention and your commitment to hearing more about this. And I'm really curious to have a chat.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions they'd like to either raise their hand and pop up and ask themselves, or you can also pop them in the chat and I'm more than happy to read them. While people are kind of thinking about what they might want to ask, I've got one. You spoke about like this was 6 months of your life and doing all of this research. I'm sure there are heaps of moments where it was like a light bulb went off, or like, oh my goodness, like it all makes sense, or one of those kinds of like wow type of moments. Does one pop to your head that kind of rises above the others?
I think that, so I feel like I'm guilty of what I presume others think too, which I think up until this moment unconsciously I really held the belief that leadership was something that we rise towards, that it's sort of tied to position in the system. And when this idea emerged that leadership is about moments in time that help us step into opportunities towards change, I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. So does that mean I could do that? And like, if you see that page in my research diary, literally is, oh my God. And that was really confronting because I didn't even know I was holding this belief. Like, I didn't even realize how much I had absorbed and drunk the Kool-Aid around organizational hierarchy and power and dominance, and how I made myself think, oh, you can't do that. You're not a GM, or you're not this, or you're not this. So you stay in a little bubble. For me, that was transformational.
Bev, go ahead. Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. It's really interesting. This is just fascinating. I think I've been working towards similar realizations for a few years, and kind of hearing you so beautifully encapsulate it all is like, this is exactly what I mean. A piece of feedback that I've been receiving quite a lot, the last 2 organizations that I've worked in, is we really want to see you step up and lead your discipline. That's what was missing. Like, if you want a leadership position, step up and lead. And it's like, I kind of think I'm doing that. Like, those moments, those opportunities to educate, those opportunities to collaborate and bring those minds together. I feel like I'm doing that. Do you think that concept of leadership is not unique, but is kind of like more design centered? Like, we have this idea of leadership, but traditional business hasn't quite caught up yet. Does that question making any sense? Is it stronger in the design space?
Yeah. So the strongest affirmation of this way of leadership actually came out of the Indigenous space, I will say. But I imagine that, or I've heard that designers are more open to that. Like, I've heard from no one as part of this research that I go, leadership is about like stepping up and be that person all the time. What I do wonder is if, yes, there is an education piece, but there's a bit of communication around stringing a story together that demonstrates your leadership. So if I think about like people who are in positions of leadership, there isn't much storytelling to be done, right? Because they're there. All of their storytelling is around influencing everybody on their playing field. When I think about this leadership relationship, where this person goes, leadership looks a certain way, and you go, no, it looks this way, and this is my way of leading. I wonder what the opportunity is to create a story around your unique way of showing up as a leader. And also asking questions around, you want me to step up and lead the discipline? What does it mean to you? What is evidence of that showing up
in the last month?
Yeah.
I think I'm doing it, but I'm clearly not. What's my blind spot? What does it look like for you feeding back to me, what do you
Yeah.
want to see? Yeah, interesting. So interesting that it's come out of the Indigenous space. You feel that's where it's strongest. I just feel like we've got so much we could learn.
100%. I agree with you, B.
Thank you.
I will say one thing. I think it's also from an organizational perspective, they might be asking you to step up, but maybe they're not actually creating the space or opportunities for you to truly do that in a way that's effective for the business. So I feel like that is a tricky question. But yeah, it's something else to consider. We did have another question pop up from in the chat. And it's which would be the best method to check the quality and effectiveness of your leadership, especially while leading without authority, surveys, results. And then if I misrepresent that question, please feel free to pop up and correct me.
And thank you for the question, Vale. It's a hairy one, that one, because leadership on the one hand is something we display, but only exists because others perceive it so, right? So I would say the first step into leadership is ultimately truly understanding what we are bringing to the table. So part of the reason why I gave you a little picture story around me and my journey into design was to be really explicit around the fact that I operate best at spaces of intersection. I'm not very good in defined spaces. And so that is part of me becoming self-aware around a preference, a bias, and an inclination that I have, and that shows up in my work. So the way I used to check in is to evaluate myself against this really dominant feature of my identity. So the very first step is always going, what do I bring? And I think it's really worthwhile to go and ask other people, what do you think I bring? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And I've done this really uncomfortable example, I think twice in the last 5 years, where I've gone, what do you know me for? When have you seen me thrive? Where do you think I could do better? And from that, it's almost like a bit of a 360. And we can definitely do that independent of authority. And then the other missing piece to that is to go, this is who I am and this is what I bring. What in my context needs to change? And you evaluate your actions against the efficacy, against the change that you're trying to see. I hope that was helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If any other questions pop up, please feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, I know design leadership is a tricky one, or leading teams in general can be quite confronting, because I feel like you have to hold a mirror up to yourself and kind of evaluate what you're doing, which can be quite difficult. Do you have any kind of tips for maybe someone just entering kind of the design leadership kind of space? Like maybe they've just been promoted or have just entered into a role, or that's what they're trying to kind of elevate their career. That's their next step. Any tips that you might kind of garner from your research?
So I think in the research, I talk about practice leadership and functional leadership, which denotes that transition, I think, that you're speaking to. And so when if you think about the practice wheel that I offered, if we try to lead through our practice, we tend to lead more into our craft. So how can I, use what I've got at my disposal better to achieve an outcome? When we step into formal design leadership roles, we anchor deeply into our context, right? So if you are suddenly a design manager, the first team is your executive. It's no longer your team, because your team is already on the same wavelength as you. Yes, you support them, you give them what they need, like you do all the mentoring and coaching, but your focus is on the paradigms and the people that sit outside of your realm of influence, because that is where you have to affect change. The change you're trying to affect no longer sits within your craft or within your discipline even. It sits in the context. And so I think that's why this can become really hard and really unsettling. But know that I think you can prep for that by starting to think about some of the context conditions that sit around you and become really, really literate in your context, and run sort of small experiments around driving change into your context that might make it less unsettling. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I think we'll take our final question from the chat. Oh,
yeah,
maybe not. Does design leadership also mean digital leadership? Raphael,
I'm curious what you mean by that. Yeah.
Yeah, same. No.
Yeah.
Raphael, would you mind clarifying that question a little bit, either popping up or typing in the chat? Awesome.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm a bit late. I had challenge joining. So, yeah. When I talk of design or digital leadership, is oftentimes people see design, and I'll talk from my space perspective. People see that the person leading digital should own design, and or in other places, I've seen a case where those doing the design are totally different from the people that are leading the digital transformation of the organization and all that. My question is, can both be combined? Can the same person leading design lead digital transformation, or should those two leadership roles be different in an organization?
I think it depends if design and digital have got the same vision for change. So if the design vision does not align with the digital vision, then that will be really hard to combine. But if you find that the purpose of digital transformation is actually reflected in the purpose of the design-led ways of working that show up, then there's a really strong argument for trying to at least co-locate them in the organization to actually amplify the efforts. I would say that the job of the leader would then be to create a shared narrative that both specialties or teams can actually embrace and work towards. And a really interesting or useful thing I've seen work is when that vision is co-created across so-called silos, and people can find themselves by being explicit around how they contribute to that vision. I would also say, is your design function largely digital, or is your design function largely non-digital, or somewhere in between? Because if you have a non-digital design function, there is more effort that needs to take place to connect the non-digital with the digital. But ultimately, as an organization, I presume you're trying to work towards the same goal, and it's about finding how we all contribute to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael.
Awesome. And then I believe Peace left more of a comment rather than a potential question. They say, as a mental health UX researcher, I test everything, not only community, but customer-facing experiences, but also internal processes, systems, new frameworks, agile rituals, etc. There's no reason why we can't use HCD and co-design and accessibility, including how to support neurodiversity in teams, principles to involve and empower the team in our leadership approach, and bring everyone together along in that journey. I find that it creates leadership at every level. Do you have a response or any commentary to what this kind of comment might suggest?
Well, I think that co-design and participatory design in particular really is a strong vehicle for democratizing leadership. And so if that is something that's already part of your approach piece, I think what you're offering, which is really wonderful, what you're offering is an opportunity and space for more people to step into their own leadership. And it's fabulous.
Awesome, thank you. And then this really will be our last question. It comes from Julie. Curious to know what are common challenges to build design leadership, if any, from the research, and what's the suggestion, maybe how you would combat some of those challenges that you saw.
Yes, there is a section on it. And I presume, Julie, that you were specifically referring to, or that you may be referring to sort of the functional challenges that people are trying to navigate, and very happy for you to actually elaborate on that question first before I respond, if you would like.
Oh no, yeah, definitely. I feel like some from functional, but also I'm curious, like if it's from because designers bring changes, like naturally people are like afraid of that. So yeah, just general question.
Yeah, okay, cool. So I think the biggest challenge, regardless of our position within the system, is trying to work with the system while trying to change it, right? How do we work with an organization and demonstrate our value while we're also trying to shift what is perceived as valuable within the organization? That tension of, at a basic level, people and profit, but at a more nuanced level around how do organizations anchor their growth in social license, right? We see this especially with big players who've reported big profits in the last of years, while the general public may have been not as well off. There is this idea that organizations need to find a way to justify effectively why they have a reason of being here. And designers can be the bridge, if they so choose, to help organizations understand not just how they can sustain and grow if they so choose, but most importantly, how they can actually anchor their desire to do better in a meaningful way in the communities and peoples who they actually serve, right? Banks are here to serve us, to help us manage our money. Insurance companies are here to manage our risk, right? Like retailers are here to help us show up in the world in ways that we're comfortable with. Like supermarkets are here to help us feed ourselves in urban centers, especially. Like they all fulfill a purpose that will help us be better off in some way. And if organizations fail to connect the dots between the reasons why they exist and their desire to have more and create more, then that's where imbalances occur. And that is the challenge that we are facing as designers, because we're straddling. We are paid by the people who we're trying to also understand that there is more to doing business or to running a government organization than outputs and reports, right? And so overcoming that is ultimately our job. Navigating this continuous journey of push and pull and try and experiment. And that is where we need community. That's where we need each other. That's where we need spaces like this. That is why the CX Collective exists, right? It's hugely effortful. It's tiring. It can take a lot out of us. It takes our motivation. It sometimes takes our sleep. And so the best thing we can do as designers is to find allies through our teams, in our organizations, and in our wider community.
That's awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Yes, very inspiring. Yeah.
Thank you, Julie, for the question. That was great.